Study through the text of James today. If you'd like, you can open your Bibles up to the text of James chapter 2. We're going to be beginning around verse 14. Before we get deep into the study, a couple of quick introductions. Terry Francis is with us. I'm Philip Martin. Andy Cantrell has joined into the study for today. Andy, how are you doing?
Doing well, man. We're just hunkered down up here in the north. So we're doing all right.
Cool. To begin with, Terry, is there anything left over from last week that you remember? You're in charge of details, facts, and accurate time zones. And so, did we?
No, we wrapped up. We wrapped up chapter 1 and put a pretty good bow on it last week. So I think we're ready for chapter 2. Is where we go here. So looking forward to today's discussion. I think it'll be really, really good, and a lot of meat in chapter 2, just like there was in chapter 1.
Absolutely. So let's get into the heart of the matter. There's no reason to dilly-dally. We can begin by, say, reading. Do you want to read the whole last chunk and see if we can cover it today, or do you want to just do it in small portions?
Let's go small portions for now.
All right. So, Andy, do you want to read verses 14 through 17 for us?
Sure. What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself.
All right, so in the first part of this text is one of the classic contrasts that the New Testament, that Jesus would often employ, that the disciples would kind of use in their teaching, where these two very opposed concepts are laid out for us in a clear, decisive way. And in here is one of the most challenging internal conflicts. That is trust, faith, conviction, belief, as compared to or connected to the other side of the thing, which is our day-to-day practical lives. It says works, and we'll talk about works in a second as the word is used here in James. But I don't know about you, but both as an individual struggle, but also on a teaching level, this particular text is immensely challenging, both to live and to understand. And to act like it's a super easy passage is something that I regret doing as a young believer. A little bit more mature now, it's a lot to digest and a lot to think about. I don't know, kind of break it down and start it in small sections a little bit. The last clause, can that faith save him? Especially as contrasted to Jesus's bold statements about the power of conviction that Jesus is who he is, and trusting that he is a representation of the Father, and looking at the disciples who followed him, who saw and knew Jesus, and then their faith was shattered at different points. What do you guys see in the text here? What are some things that are insightful to you individually, or that might be good for the rest of us?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is the phrase you just mentioned, the idea that there's a faith that doesn't save, and I think that's interesting. Now, I don't think that means necessarily, and then we'll see this kind of borne out through here, that it's not real faith, but the idea that there could be a profession of faith that doesn't result in salvation, and we are practicing a saving faith, and one that has the results that we want. Now, I think that the difficulty of that, if you're not careful, that this passage is somewhat difficult, because if you're not careful, you can make this passage say things that it's not saying, and that's the challenge to all of this. And you can represent it in a way that I think is unfair to the text, because this text is, and I think this is the key. I think sometimes we have a tendency to take this section of scripture in chapter 2 and make it about works, but it's about faith. and works is in there. It's about both, I understand, but it is about real faith and what faith looks like. And I think that often has to be the focus of this, is make sure we see what it's talking about with faith. That's the key.
Yeah. So, Andy, did you have something, at least in this introduction section?
Sure. You had mentioned last week when I was with you that so much of the book of James is kind of a parallel to the Sermon on the Mount, has a lot of the themes that it does. And it just strikes me that Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount very similarly to this, about how people think about themselves or how people talk about themselves. Many will say to me on that day, hey, didn't we do this in your name and do this in your name? What's interesting even about that text is that was some work that people did. But the point that Jesus was making, the point James keeps making in his letter, is God measures things differently than we do. We might think things to ourselves or say things to ourselves, but that doesn't make them so.
Mm-hmm.
God measures the product. God measures the activity. Back in James chapter 1, he said that when he was talking about if you're a hearer of the word and not a doer, the blessing's in the doing. The blessing's not in, number one, the hearing of it, or the proclamation of it, or saying that you have true and undefiled religion, or saying that you have faith. This theme is in every chapter in some ways. When we get to chapter 3, verse 13, he's going to ask the question about who is wise and understanding among you. That's a foolish thing to raise your hand for. Like, who's wise and understanding among you? Nobody's going to raise their hand and say, well, I am. The next phrase is, let him show by his. So James is concerned with the same thing as Jesus was. Don't be people who think things to yourself. Don't be people who claim things for yourself. Be people who show faithfulness and wisdom and loyalty.
Go
faith,
ahead, Terry.
Well, I was just going to say, follow that up. Faith is something that can be seen. It's not just professed. And I think that's really what all of James is really talking about. Something that is witnessed, not just something that is heard in that sense.
Yeah.
Do you guys think part of the issue with discussing faith in our time is that people have made faith simply something we do with our minds and not something we do with our lives? That the idea of the Bible word for faith includes the idea of faithfulness and not just a mental sort of assent, but a way of life about us. And I think that there's a whole bunch of New Testament writings that's really their intent, is to show that that's what faith really is not just something we do with our minds.
Yeah,
I
I'd
think,
agree with that.
Absolutely. I'd extend it to a culture of skepticism regarding the unseen realm. You've got a small percentage of modern America, and that's really our source context, at least for our personal evangelistic work, who lives on the fringe of spirituality and the unseen realm, of ghosts, boogeymen, all of that. You've got another fringe that lives in the hardcore atheist batch, which is growing, that says all of that is bunk, that none of that is genuine, whether it's legitimate or illegitimate. And the vast middle ground is very unconnected to both the spiritual realm and living in a way that couples their life with the spiritual realm. And so when you talk about heaven, or you talk about God has become very distant from mankind from the perspective of most of the people I sit down to study with, who aren't really biblically conversant, even though they may have come from a religious or a spiritually focused home where the Bible or Holy Scriptures as they see them have been read regularly. And so when we start talking about things like verse 17, so faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. It's almost an engineer's response. This is a mechanical argument. And the mechanical argument is I have to have 1 + 1. And when I have 1 + 1, I have achieved whatever mathematical goal I have, rather than maybe a more holistic, or just maybe a parallel, like Andy pointed out from our earlier studies, parallel to the teaching of Jesus. Some of his statements here are very much what Jesus was getting at in the Gospel of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, when he talks about, go in peace, be warm and filled, as the behavior of some. That's powerful. At least if we want to live that way, and especially we can tie it to our present context a little bit outside of our assemblies when we're gathered together with believers to praise God, and in our personal interactions with people we meet in any context. I think there's some power there that we're missing if we don't live that way.
One more thing about this section is, and you're going to see this more than once. And one of the things I always really focus in on is the statement in verse 17 about faith without works, or if it does not have works, is dead. I mean, what we're talking about here is in one sense a faith that doesn't save, but then it's also described as a dead faith, a faith that in that sense is not active, it's not fruitful, it has no value to it whatsoever. And I think that's one of the things and that's one of the ideas here that I see, is that what he's really pointing out, and that's why this is about faith, is that, and what you're really going to, I think, see through here is real faith acts and works. It's not that he's emphasizing works, it's that he's saying this is what real active faith does to a person. The power of the gospel is the fact that it changes us, and faith changes who we are, but it changes what we do as a part of that as well. And that is seen outwardly. There's other passages, people by their fruits, same kind of concept, same kind of idea. So whenever I get back, one of the things I use the most about James 2 is that statement, faith without works is dead. Not the idea that works is our focus, but faith is the focus. But if it's real, genuine faith, it's going to work. It's not just going to be dormant or, like Andy said, this more intellectual, academic kind of approach.
Yeah.
So,
that, yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Well, I find it interesting that statement and that idea is presented more than once here. This dead faith, over and over again.
So I think it's a valid question to ask too. What does James have in mind when he says works that accompany faith? Because I think a lot of our discussions get into theological things like, well, does that mean somebody's going to be baptized? Does that mean somebody's going to obey these commands or those commands? Like, what does it mean? And I think it would include anything that our master taught, our Savior taught. And if we really believe him and we believe in him, we're going to do what he said. But it strikes me that James, back in verse 1 of this chapter, he talks about holding our faith with an attitude of personal favoritism. And he links faith there to the way we treat somebody who comes into our assembly. It's really like the work that he's talking about is love. Just like here in verse 15 and 16, the illustration that he uses is about loving somebody who's in need. You see a brother or sister in need and you say the right words to them, be warmed and filled, but you don't do anything to help them. The question James is asking is, how can that really be faith? So faith and love in James' writing is going together here. Just like faith and love would go in the teaching of Jesus, and faith and love would go in the writings of Paul. The expressions of love we have for our fellow man prove whether or not we love God. That's what 1 John is all about. If you say you love God, but you don't love your brother, you're just lying. Just like if you say you have faith, but you don't give people what they need, you're lying. So it strikes me that that's an important contextual thought about what James has in mind for work here.
I completely agree. That's seen, I think, throughout the entire Bible, Andy, and we talked about this, I think, last Friday and a couple times last week, that even the Old Testament, that scene with prophets like Amos that come in and they've left God. And one of the kind of identifiers of that is the fact that they are not treating one another in love with the correct attitude. You go to Matthew 25, and that throne scene picture there at the end of the chapter in those three parables is all about treatment of other people. So when you go and look at all of those different things and you add it together, I think one of the things that and by the way, I was thinking about the works, I think it's the same ideas in Ephesians 2:8-10, that we're saved by grace through faith, but we're his workmanship created for good works. So all of those things, I think, go over and over again. I think one of the great disservices that we've done to this passage is we've used this as a proof text for baptism and obedience in baptism, which, quite frankly, it was. I don't think that really fits here. I think there's better discussions from other texts than this.
Mhm.
I think this is a better text to talk about what you're talking about, which is the idea that faith is manifested in your life to change you in the way you treat other people, and the way you act in everyday life, in the way you take care of folks, the way you react to them, your relationships. All of that is changed, and you're somebody who is zealous and active for good works, what we call good works.
Yeah.
And that seems to fit the entire context of the chapter. Like you said, going all the way back to the beginning of chapter 2 with how you treat other people. Now, again, how you treat other people. All of those are, I think, very important things to consider.
Yeah, it's definitely a kingdom message rather than a mechanical lever to move one stone. It's really a message designed to draw hearts into the full picture of being a committed disciple of Jesus. I think, and that includes those micro interactions. Andy mentioned the visitor in the assembly model. You think about how our interactions typically can go in those assembly. Oh, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here. Or, oh, it's been since a week since last Sunday. How you doing? I'm doing good. That's all surface level stuff, and there's a value to it, and we need those kind of interconnectors on a personal level. But that's why a friend of mine years ago had the double question. No, how are you really doing? It shocks us the first time we ask that question or get asked that question because it's obviously we're asking a different level of interaction at that point. And I think there's a lot of that here in James, particularly with the broader spiritual context of the Christians who are scattered, the Christians who are welcoming them in, and what their life is going to need to look like going forward. A couple of things before we go to the next check of the text. I wanted to highlight a couple of questions/comments. Bob mentioned that he hears James 2 quoted more as a conversion baptism argument than a kingdom citizen faith challenge. I think that's a good summary of some of the things we've said. Mark Russell has a good comment as well. He says, it seems that the Lord and now his brother are saying that any sort of evaluative process we might come up with that condenses our service to the Lord to any sort of list is flawed. And the problem is that there is a continuing issue with people of any semblance of faith since the beginning. That this is this kind of behavioral mechanic, if you will. Anything else from you guys before we kind of scoot forward?
I'm good.
All right, so let's go ahead and move into the next textual chunk that we had talked about. This begins for us now in verse 18. I'm sure Hal's excited. He's interested to see how we're going to respond to verses 18 and 19. Terry, could you read verses 18 and 19 for us?
But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder.
All right, so on first level, the text seems really simple, right? Clearly this is absolutely the most obvious passage in the entire New Testament. It's probably as obvious as Jesus wept. Or whatever's going on with the Old Testament kings and their lineage, or whatever's going on with Samson and the judges. Clearly, this is the simple one, right?
If only that were the case, because it appears simple until you actually read it the second time and go, oh, wait a minute. That's not so easy.
Yeah. So, honing in on verse 18, we'll kind of break it into two sections because I think it's important to see the application side. Someone will say, you have faith and I have works. What is the nature of James's question? I think that's a way I like to approach things, is to figuring out what's going on here. Is this similar to the questions that Paul responds to in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians? Is it similar to some of Paul's rhetorical questions that he employs? Is it similar to the nature of some of Jesus's question-response parable introductions? Like, what is James doing here as a conversational tool to help us begin to understand his answer? Because he gives us an answer. Like, there's a levered answer in the text. Andy?
Well, I mean, I may not have thought deeply enough about it. I've just always thought it was rhetorical, kind of a, hey, imagine this conversation taking place between people who say they believe and say that they have faith. And James is challenging people that talk like that to kind of put up or shut up. Like, hey, you're going to say you have faith, but are you going to be able to show that? Like, is that real? I have a couple comments. I mean, I'm not sure if you want to get that answered first before.
Oh yeah, no, bring it all in. This is a smorgasbord buffet, potluck. So let's go.
One of the things I like about this particular set of verses is that verse 18 uses the word faith and verse 19 uses the word believe. And they're forms of the same idea. But I think sometimes when people talk about belief and they talk about faith, they actually think of those as slightly different things. But in James' mind, belief and faith are the same conversation here. Pistis versus pisteo, or however you say those words. But one of my favorite ways to study this idea of what is real belief, what is real faith, is actually from the Gospel of John. And I don't want to get us off track, but for people that are interested, I use this text a lot with people who struggle to understand what belief and faith really are. The word for believe is only used like 9 times in Matthew, like 14 times in Mark, 9 times in Luke, but 92 times in John. Like 92 times John's going to use this word believe, and he's going to use it in some really interesting ways. Like in John 8, it will say that many Jews came to believe in him when he was speaking. And then in the very next couple verses, he says, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And they become offended. And the text says they believed, but he goes on to say that they weren't free yet. And then goes on to tell them that their father was the devil in that same text. But the text very clearly says that they believed. So just like the demons can believe something, that's not really the idea of biblical faith, biblical belief. And the Gospel of John tells many stories like that, where the people believed in Jesus, but then it says he would not entrust himself to them because he knew what was in them. It's the same word there. He wouldn't entrust himself. He wouldn't believe them, even though they believed him. So this idea that the demons can believe something or people can believe something, but not be committed, not really be faithful, is a really important consideration. I think that's what James is getting at. I think that's what John's gospel is getting at. But it's so relevant today with people that we study with.
I think there's an intended contrast there between the faith of 18 and believe in verse 19. And I think that helps us understand kind of this statement that starts verse 18, that the faith that they're talking about is kind of this contrast. Well, yeah, I have faith, you have works. And I think it's this attempt to dissect the two, that it goes back to what I said earlier, that what James is saying is you can't have one without the other. If faith doesn't have works, it's dead. Here's a guy who says, I have faith, you have works. And he's kind of saying his faith is okay without the works, is what it seems like. And the answer there seems to be in verse 19. He kind of plays off of that and go, okay, well, you believe in God. You believe that God is one. That's good. Demons believe. But the implication there certainly is that's not faith. And so then when you go back to, well, then what determines the difference in this text, at least, the difference between faith and belief, if they're not the same? And what James says in verse 18 is the idea of the works. Now, I think one of the things to be very careful here is when he says, I'll show you my faith by my works, I don't think we should take that as James walking around and making sure everybody sees his works, boasting of them. That would be a clear violation of things Jesus taught there in the Sermon on the Mount, not to boast of your works, right? It's more the idea of that the difference between faith and belief is seen in people's actions. It is more than just professing this belief in God. It is something that is active and working, and that is the challenge. And in trusting, as you said, all of that together is really what I take these two verses to really focus in on. And by the way, I think it's really interesting is the idea that even demons believe and shudder. I mean, there's an implication of a level of fear there, isn't there, by the demon? So just because somebody believes in God enough that they are afraid doesn't mean that that's faith. So I think again, there's a lot in those two verses.
It's a really powerful punch if we let it have the time that God allowed it. Especially then, like you guys are kind of connected on the other end, the end on the weight of the demon's conviction. Again, that spiritual realm, the unseen realm, the things that we as believers today struggle to acknowledge. On the one hand, we live in a context where we are more blessed than the prophets who were before us because we have seen the resolution of God's plan. And yet, for many of them, from Genesis to Jesus, the anticipation and expectation of miraculous works is standard. It's standard in their culture. It's standard in their communities. It's standard in their day-to-day lives. If you read the writings of the Christians of the first century in the New Testament, if you look at the ancient Near East as a group, the Galilean area was literally just anticipating on a regular basis, when is the Messiah coming? When is he here? Where are the signs? We desperately want him. We desperately need him. And Jesus arrived in the midst of all of that anticipation. Where if you were to talk to just Christians today, the Christians that you and I know, and say things like, do you think that God is still going to do a miracle today and heal somebody? We're going to struggle to get an answer sometimes because we have, I think, declawed the God of the heavens into the concept of being really soft. No, he's not really doing that in the earth yet. We're just kind of waiting. We're on our own. Where New Testament texts like this talk about present tense after the resurrection, demons' belief status. Prayer in this context talks about a belief in the unseen realm. And I think that contrast is digging beneath the surface level of, I've got to do what God says, and say, I've got to believe who God is. I think that's kind of where it ends up and where he lives. Hal asked a question, are the two questions parallel to modern conversations with faith-only advocates accusing me and others of believing in salvation by works? And I'll get to Mark Russell's question in a second. What's your guys' response to those? I don't know if you saw it. I could read it again if you need me to.
I saw it. My answer is I don't think they're parallel, and let me explain why. I don't think that's the context of James 2. And part of that is I think one of the things to think about is who this is written to. And I think there's a different application for us today than this salvation question. James 2 is written to disciples who have been scattered. And I think the better application of this passage is to people who have already obeyed the gospel in that sense. But they've not been changed, and they don't have the faith that has changed their actions. And so one of the reasons I am hesitant to use this in that is because that's not the context. James 2 is not written to arm us with a weapon to fight the doctrine of faith only. And I'm not saying you're wrong for doing that. I just prefer not to use that because I think the greater application here is Christians can be guilty of what chapter 2, verses 18 and 19 are saying. That people who go to church all the time, who claim to be disciples, who we meet with on a regular basis, I think the greater application there is that what they consider to be faith and what they consider to be their faith is not true faith. And that brings in Mark Russell's question, by the way, Phil, of would the priest and Levite claimed to have faith as they were walking to or from Jericho. That's the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus would say no, and so would James, but they would say yes. And I think that's the idea. Those were the religious elite that Jesus pointed out, and they would have claimed to have faith, and yet the whole story points that they don't have faith. That's not. And so I think one of the dangers of James 2 is to take this and try to take this section of scripture and point towards people that are not us, when I think the real application should begin with us first. That us as Christians, this is about the danger we have of making our faith very shallow and changing it from a faith to something that's not equal, but perhaps even less than what the demons have in that sense. And so that's one of my hesitancies to make this the proof text weapon of the faith only argument, is because I think the original context is something that probably is a better application for some of us today.
Andy?
Well, I mean, I get where Terry's coming from on this. I will say this text has changed a lot of people's minds that we're faith only believers. Like, I mean, I've used this text for years and years. And there's probably been times where I've not used it well, but I will say, I think part of the problem I've had in the past is that I've taken it here when I'm only talking about things like how to be saved initially, like with baptism or confession, or, what people consider works generally. But this is a salvation text. If you look again at verse 14, the question he asks is, can that faith save him? This is about being saved in this text.
Mm-hmm.
But the point James is making is not, you should get baptized then, or you should make confession then. He's making the same point that, again, most all the New Testament gospel or letter writers make, which is, if we say we love God, we have to love people. If we don't love people, we don't love God. We have to walk in the light. If we don't walk in the light as he is in the light, we're liars. Like, everyone would tell people that were claiming to be in Christ or said they belong to Christ, if these realities aren't true, then you're really not living a faithful life. Matthew 25, when Jesus says he was going to separate the sheep and the goats, he doesn't say, on this side will be the baptized and on this side the unbaptized. He says, on one side will be the people who didn't care about people, who didn't feed and visit and clothe, and because these activities are the proof. But that being said, that is the context, I still think the concept of, if we really believe Jesus to be the Lord, it doesn't matter what he commanded. If it's the new commandment of love, then we obey him. If it's the commandment of the new covenant to confess his name and to be baptized into him, then we do that because we trust him. So I mean, I personally think it still is a good text to work through what is real belief, what is real faith.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it really, again, James is like an expanded edition of the Sermon on the Mount, which was the announcement of the kingdom and becoming genuine disciples of Jesus, and throwing aside the preconceptions of who the Messiah was going to be. Really was essential to do that. But then on the day-to-day change level, there's a lot that I see in James that mimics the expectations of God for our hearts, especially now as you shift into the next couple verses. And we've got just a few minutes from our planned time. We can certainly go longer if we want to, but we kind of set a guide of, we're going to try to keep these daily studies about 30 minutes. And so probably a good idea to pause here. Andy, if you can be back tomorrow, you're more than welcome to join in that conversation.
I appreciate it. I'm not sure that I'll be able to, but I'll check my schedule.
But
Bill, let me add real quick that I'm not saying don't use 1819 that way. I'm saying I don't use it that way, and that's, I want to make sure everybody knows that. I'm not criticizing you if you do. I will say, make sure that's not the only way we use verse 18 and 19, and that is what sometimes I think bothers me is we don't make that next step application. And the part that frustrates me about that is that this has become for many just a proof text for faith only, and they miss the greater application, which Andy included, by the way.
Yeah.
And that's really one of my problems with the way we handle this text is we have taken it and missed the original intent for a current application, and we ignore the context and what the greater maybe principles should be added in there.
Yeah, fully agree to that. I think there is a depth to discipleship that James is trying to either both prepare or admonish his listeners and readers to live for. And there's a depth of discipleship that you and I and all of us in our service need to develop. And particularly discipleship on a day-to-day basis is going to be more valuable than ever. We're not going to have the same kind of support network spiritually that we're accustomed to with what seems to be needed right now for our nation's healthcare issues. And so this kind of deep discipleship is a now thing. And if you haven't been working on understanding what James is looking for us, well, this is the time to do it. Really become devout disciples of the King and live in a way that's strong that way.
Can I ask a question? Just you brought something up, and I want to.
Uh-oh.
We'll go a few minutes longer. If we go back to the first section we looked at, and this just hit me in what you're talking about, our current health crisis. I'm going to get a little bit on the edge here. I do think one of the things to maybe think of there in that discussion is, it talks about in their verses 14 through, I guess it's 17, about go and warm and be filled, but you don't do anything for them. I will say I do think that there's a lot of people who right now with the health crisis are relying on faith in God's ability to protect us, which I agree with, but then are going about ignoring any of the suggestions. And I wonder if that's not a lot like saying go and warm and be filled and doing nothing in that sense. And that's just a thought that hit me that maybe we should think of today. Hey, look, my family is quarantined. We have personal reasons for that. It's not fun. Phil and I were joking earlier, we may all need therapy after this is over. The psychology professionals may have their best year yet once we're released from our homes. But there is a part of this where loving your neighbor and loving your brother is doing things beyond just praying for them, but taking the necessary actions that correlate with that thought. So I'll dance on the edge and put that out there, and you all don't have to comment.
I don't mind commenting. I'll close out comments. I'll let Andy, if he wants to add an extra comment right here, this is a great time to do so about Terry's supposedly risky statement.
No, I agree.
I'll just say this. For my brethren and for the believers that I know, the best encouragement I can give to you is to read Galatians 6, verse 10, and do your very best to practice it on a personal level. That includes how you respond to the government's expectations in Romans chapter 13 and be a dutiful citizen, but it allows you the opportunity to do more than the government asks. It's not just about the expectation of social distancing. Consider the historical behavior of believers in the Spanish flu and their willingness to sacrifice their own health to help others. This is a different thing than staying home to keep people safe. This is volunteering to do risky things because risky things need to be done. And there's a difference between serving in that way and serving yourself. And the saddest illustration of that are the folks who hoard toilet paper or hoard sanitation devices. That's just not healthy spiritual behavior.
Dude, they're hoarding ketchup. I went to the store the other day. We needed ketchup. There's no ketchup on the shelf. What kind of people hoard ketchup? I'm so angry about that. I had to get organic ketchup. Do you know how bad that is to get organic ketchup? This is ridiculous. I'm going to need therapy. I'm telling you. You cannot take my ketchup away.
Yeah, I got tortillas. I can make tacos, and I can smoke brisket. I think I'm satisfied for quite a long time.
Absolutely.
At this time, though, it's a good time for us to close out. Andy and Terry, thank you guys for joining in this Bible study. All those who participated in the live feed, we're thankful that you're here. As always, if you have questions about what we've just studied, other matters spiritually, and in the broader context of our Do the Work studies, if you want to know about the work of evangelism and aspects of that, just let us know. Drop us a message. We'd be happy to help. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great and wonderful day.